Good morning, Internet people. This is yet another episode of the Hardline According to Stonefruit with my stone cold ace, Mark French.
Hey, everybody.
And as usual, this is accompanied by an article at stonefruit.substack.com where the title is The Hypocrisies Baked into the Birth of the International Liberal Democratic Order, which is now collapsing.
Yeah.
And my thesis is that there are a few cardinal domestic sins in America, which after all was the major architect of the International Liberal Democratic Order, that preclude it from really being thought of as a truly liberal international order. Although the ones we're going to talk about today, don't match the true cardinal sins of America, which of course are the theft of an entire continent from the Indians and slavery.
Sure.
But here we go. So since the International Liberal Democratic Order is in the process of imploding, now is as good a time as any to discuss how it emerged, the contradictions it was born with, the great promise it held initially, and where we are now. So, to my mind, the earliest international liberal democratic order in the 20th century was clearly Woodrow Wilson. But his attempt to create a liberal order abroad needs to be considered in tandem with his extremely reactionary actions at home. Interesting side note, Mark. He's from Augusta, Georgia, and I had a friend from Austin that moved there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he invited me to move there. He said it was like a mini Austin. So I did, and there's a Woodrow Wilson, his house is a museum. I didn't visit it.
Yeah, right.
But
Jekyll Island is also not that far from there.
there's surfing too. But his extreme repressiveness on the domestic front establishes how his liberal aspirations abroad were already fraught with deep contradictions, establishing a pattern that would plague all further attempts at sustaining subsequent international liberal democratic orders, which always held great promise, but were never as liberal as they purported to be.
Yeah.
And always coexisted with incessant, vile behavior by the United States from then until now. And Wilson took a lot of flack during that brief moment when Black Lives Matter actually had some credibility for being such a racist mofo, and he certainly deserved it. But to my mind, he deserves perhaps even more flack for how abusive he was to the Bill of Rights and early American peaceniks and radicals. And even though he campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," he started sending military aid to Allied France and England. We've talked about this before. And then feigned shock and horror when the publicly advertised unrestricted German submarine warfare blew some of it up. Lusitania. And as a good example of how America started using propaganda with war from the get-go, less than a week after America entered World War I, he set up, in April 1917, he set up the Committee on Public Information. It saturated the public with pro-war propaganda, turning the war into a crusade for democracy abroad while destroying it at home.
Sure.
2 months later, Congress passed the Espionage Act, in June 2017, criminalizing anti-war speech and action, making a mockery of the First Amendment. He even enlisted the aid of the Postmaster General in his campaign, and the Postal Service just said whatever it felt was anti-war was undeliverable.
Yeah.
Which included 74 newspapers.
Right.
So much for freedom of the press.
Yeah.
Like Trevor Noah said, we have at the last correspondence dinner, we have such a free press. That's why we're about to deport Assange. Although it sounds like Australia might be stepping in to help support Assange.
If they don't, if you're not going to protect one of your own citizens, and this was one thing that you haven't said yet that's so relevant about the piece. Julian Assange is not an American citizen. Julian Assange's company, even if they wanted to go the corporate route, Assange is not filed and does not do business in America. That is not where his corporate headquarters is. The idea that the United States, he's not American and his business is not American.
He's not an American citizen.
That's exactly right. The United States has no standing in the prosecution of this man. If Australia agrees to basically just having any of their citizens arrested by the United States anywhere on the planet Earth and being deported and kidnapped by the United States, I do not see how the citizens there are okay with this.
Well, Australia is definitely kind of a junior partner in the Anglo-American settler colonial set.
Well, to England for sure, and then by proxy, England to America. But that's a very tenuous arrangement to have someone de facto given a death sentence to languish in prison without a hearing. I mean, it's really a unique, weird situation. And the other reason that I think normal citizens, regardless of what country you were fortunate enough to be born in, should pay attention to it. This is how all of us share information with each other at this point. If I'm given a clip by someone that I find publicly relevant, it is my duty and responsibility to give it to other people and discuss it. So if this is allowed to happen to Julian Assange, the idea that it can't immediately happen within the next few years to me or you or the universal you, which is all of us, if you can't see that, I don't know what hole you're living in. Like, you have to be so naive or ostrich scared to stick your head in the sand on this one, to think that they're not just going to blanket apply that to everyone. If you think this is specific to one individual, I have a bridge to sell you.
I agree wholeheartedly, and we'll circle back to Assange a little further down the piece for sure.
Sure.
But for now, let's continue galloping through the heinousness of Wilson's administration.
Yeah, it matters.
In 1917, socialist Charles Schenck was arrested under the Espionage Act for tossing flyers opposing the draft out of a high-rise building in New York City. In Schenck versus United States, 1919, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act. This is the court case in which Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. gave America the chestnut, "You can't yell fire in a crowded theater." That's not the quote. The real quote is, quote, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. But in a sense, it doesn't matter because it was in dictum, which just spells out the justice's line of thinking.
Yeah.
The ruling, it didn't have binding authority. But in May 1918, the Espionage Act was amended to include the Sedition Act. And approximately 2,000 people were prosecuted under these two laws. None of them were Allied spies or saboteurs.
Right.
And in addition to those who were arrested and incarcerated, hundreds of Americans were deported after negligible due process, in spite of the fact that none of them were illegal immigrants or convicted criminals. And one example that's really near and dear to my heart is the case of Emma Goldman. One of them, because I'm an anarchist, and she's a badass.
Sure.
And she was deported back to the land of her birth, Russia.
Right.
And then in April 1919, after the World War I had ended, Eugene Debs was convicted for seditious speech.
Yeah.
Debs had already run for president 4 times.
Right.
He was a man of stature.
Yeah.
So,
and to bring it into modern day, to bring it into modern day, I'm almost positive Barack Hussein Obama leads all the presidents in prosecutions under the Espionage Act.
Wow.
I'm nearly certain Barack Obama leads prosecutions and legal cases under that act.
You know, everyone had such high hopes for him. I never did from the very beginning, because there are 3 things you have to do to be considered a credible candidate for president.
Sure.
And that is to allow corporate rule led by Wall Street.
Yeah.
To allow the permanent war to go uninhibited.
Box checked. Yeah.
And to allow the most racist, militaristic elements of Israel to continue doing whatever they want.
Box checked.
And I saw him send out coded messages for all 3 of those. So I was not fooled at all.
No, he put the Clinton model on steroids, and it's everyone's optimism for that man turned out to just be a personal projection, because he told the truth the whole time. Like, going back and listening to him and looking at his stuff, he was very, very clear the direction he was going to go. I mean, when Bob Rubin handed him his Citigroup appointment list of who was going to be in the cabinet, it was all of them except for one. Yeah. Everybody except one person on the Citigroup appointment list of who is going to determine policy and run that administration was hired.
Yeah, it's pretty heinous. It's so funny that we were born in the same hospital and went to the same school. But the Sedition Act is repealed, but the Espionage Act is still on the books today. And that's what Daniel Ellsberg faced charges in 1973 for releasing the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah.
Which had an explosive cultural impact against the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Compare that to the release in 2019 by the Washington Post, in a rare occasion of actual investigative journalism, the Afghanistan Papers, which, like the Pentagon Papers, said that the war was geopolitically pointless, unimaginably cruel, fraught with lies from top to bottom. But the Afghanistan Papers had no impact, which proves how inured the American public has become to the permanent war.
Well, listen to how cool what you just said is. How is there no anti-war liberal? There's none. Not
It's on the
Rachel
right wing
Maddow,
now.
not Lawrence O'Donnell. Yeah, right. How has there's no liberals that are anti-war. It doesn't exist. There is no anti-war movement. So how quickly has an entire populace been anesthetized and placates to permanent war culture? It's not even a serious discussion that can be had of why not protecting naval shipping lanes, which is an antiquated thing. How is it not even discussed that some of this spending should begin to be unwound? It's insane.
You know, I think it's in large part due to the fact that it's now an all-volunteer army, and it's a poverty draft.
It is.
So because it's an all-volunteer army, it can be out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
And I
Sure.
forget the exact factoid, but I think it's this. I think Alabama sends more people into the military than New York, Chicago, and LA combined.
Oh, per capita? Yeah, that doesn't shock me.
No,
Yeah, absolutely. No,
There's a
just
gross
period.
number.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And if you did it per capita, I would not be surprised at the plain states. Because I just spent 5 years in Montana, I guarantee if you aggregated per capita, if you did Montana, Idaho, the Dakotas, Iowa, like if you did those, poor and working white people in the plain states, like so much of our political capital gets spent on the big cities, right? So you have the Christian Bible Belt South just for weather and tax policy and things of that nature. So you have the Orlando to Dallas squad. 3 of the biggest cities in the United States exist in Texas, but Texas is not culturally relevant at all. It doesn't create national policy. It's its own place. So you have Dallas, Houston, and the Hill Country, Austin, San Antonio, and all that stuff. All 3 of those cities are 3 of the 10 biggest cities in the country. But Texas, as far as actual policy and culture are concerned, doesn't exist in New York or Washington or Oregon or California or Florida. Like those are their own places. So there's a unique situation growing where military participation does not equate to a national perception of culture, I guess is the simplest way to boil it down. It's an avenue for all poor kids to leave their houses and have a real job. If you're not going to flip burgers somewhere or pump gas somewhere or be a cashier somewhere and you want to get out of your house, just join the military. So across all of the rural areas and across all of the urban ghettos, you have poor kids participating in the military because they have no other way to make 35 or 45 grand a year and be independent and be able to get the hell out of the house that they grew up in.
That's absolutely true. And I don't think the coastal elites can ever resist calling the middle of the country flyover country.
Flyover country. That is so disgusting that you would refer to your own populace in that way. What the hell does that even mean?
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up these
contemporary.
Wrap up the contemporary asides regarding the Espionage Act and jump back to Wilson. So it's the Espionage Act under which Snowden would face charges if he ever returned from Russia.
Right.
And I think we both agree Julian Assange is the most consequential publisher and journalist of a generation.
Absolutely.
And it's the Espionage Act under which he will face charges if he gets extradited for the crime of displaying absolutely heinous war crimes to the world. And I think his greatest crime was the release of collateral murder in Iraq.
Which is the Chelsea Manning footage, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I watched that yesterday researching for this piece again. You know, I hadn't seen it in a few years, and
it's disgusting.
It's beyond disturbing. It's just a helicopter gunship just hosing down civilians and children.
Well, and when you play the audio and you hear what those kids are saying in the helicopter, it makes it even worse.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable and very embarrassing to the American empire.
It's super embarrassing.
Which is why they want him. But as we said a little earlier, he's not an American citizen. It didn't take place on American soil, but the empire still has reach. But if he gets into America, he's going to rot in a high security prison, probably in solitary, and probably die within a couple years max.
He's already stressed out and unhealthy. They're trying to kill him before this thing actually makes it into court. Because if any courts are going to be real, this has no standing.
So that's the contemporary asides regarding the Espionage Act. So back to Wilson.
Yes.
And on January 2 and 3 of 1920, 4,000 American citizens in 23 states were arrested in the Palmer raids, which I wish every American would know about. The Palmer raids, which were needlessly brutal, didn't have valid search warrants, lacked basic due process, made a mockery of the Bill of Rights, simply because the political radicalism of those arrested was at variance with the American values. So Wilson's on a crusade to make the world safe for democracy and tried to create the League of Nations, which was never ratified by the United States, and crashed and burned. And Wilson was a noted fan of self-determination for white people in Middle and Eastern Europe, like to get out from under the thumb of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and such.
Right.
But not for the black and brown subjects of colonial empires. So moving past Wilson, we can jump into Roosevelt's famous 4 freedoms, which he enunciated in his January 1941 State of the Union speech. And the first is, quote, it's going to be a quote block. Quote, the first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear. Now, the first 2 are nominally protected by the First Amendment.
Sure.
Although the Wilson administration proves how perpetually tenuous these alleged freedoms actually are.
Yeah.
The latter 2 freedoms exceed the constitutional values enunciated in the Bill of Rights.
Certainly.
Freedom from want implies a broad human development as the end of economic security. Freedom from fear refers to ending an atmosphere of permanent war that would preclude any meaningful economic security. And researching for this piece was fun because I read a lot of stuff I wasn't familiar with, including the Atlantic Charter.
Yeah.
And that was another important milestone in creating an international liberal democratic order as the 20th century moved along. And this pivotal document grew out of a clandestine meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill, ships off of Newfoundland in Canada. In August 9/12, 41. And this was the first time they met as heads of state.
Yes.
And it established the basis of their partnership for World War II. And the latter two of Roosevelt's four freedoms, freedom from fear and want, they migrated into the Atlantic Charter's sixth point, which is, quote, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to see established peace, which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all the men in all lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. The document had some other attractive principles among its 8 points as well. And one was, quote, no aggrandizement, territorial or other, end quote. And I'm wondering whether that might be a reference to the fact that the British Empire actually reached its largest extent in 1920 after the Treaty of Versailles, when it absorbed the Ottoman Empire territories in the Middle East.
So before you continue, listen to how cool that is. So I agree with what you just said. So look at how close that was to the Suez Canal incident that fast forwarded the collapse of the pound sterling as the hegemonic currency of the globe. That was the world reserve currency. So from the incident that you just said, the Suez Canal was less than 50 years later.
That was 51, right? I think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you just extrapolate that out, look how fast potentially the dollar could be unspun as the pound sterling under those same conditions, which we are currently in.
Yeah, I think realistically speaking, the British Empire reached the zenith of its power in the 1880s.
But, yeah, I agree with that.
But and it was broke after World War I. But
that's right.
But it actually reached its largest geographical extent in 1920.
Yeah.
After the Treaty of Versailles.
I know, but it's just like what you just said is so cool. Over expansion is what fast forwards demise, right?
Yeah. Well, they were pretty expanded because they had 26. They had 26% of the globe.
Yeah.
So the Atlantic Charter also propounded self-determination as a sovereign right, which is a difficult circle to square considering the United States has broken every treaty it has ever signed with Indian tribes and started an overseas empire in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. And my Kanaka Maoli brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles in Hawaii are struggling to regain their sovereignty as well.
Yes.
But the Atlantic Charter also argued for free trade and access to raw materials for, quote, victor and vanquished alike as the key to, quote, economic prosperity. But I actually like it because they said, quote, the whole point is, quote, improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. We don't even talk like that. Those are decent goals, which have been in severe remission in America since what I consider the magic year, 1971.
Yeah.
And I encourage all of our viewers to go to stonefruit.substack.com and click on that link 1941, because it will lead you to a site that has about 40 charts. That's when every economic of fairness and progress for the working and middle class totally tanked. And the seventh point of the Atlantic Charter was a plea for freedom of navigation of the oceans. And at present, that's exactly the rationale the United States uses to justify sending warships up and down the Taiwan Straits.
Yeah.
Even though, as we like to say so often, Seventh Fleet can't stop crashing. And it's even more ironic because the United States did not sign the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is one in a long list of treaties that the United States has never signed.
Well, and that's one thing that's so prevalent about your work is it points out the times that this country has participated and where it does not. Sometimes the biggest truth is in the areas that are left unsaid, right? So it becomes blatantly clear that the things that they sign are within their purview and control, and that the things they choose not to sign are going to hold them under global public scrutiny. At the end of the day, regardless of what any individual feels like the United States is relevant or not relevant, at the end of the day, the United States is only like 6% of the population of the entire planet Earth. So if we are going to continue to acquire and exude and have want for more power and what the exercise of that looks like, the thing about hard power is it's only justified by soft power. So if we aren't actually feeding people and making their lives better, it makes our drone strikes look less legitimate. So I guess if you can get everybody to buy into the fact that our missiles and strikes bring peace, which just on its face is a little bit preposterous, and you also agree that our financial systems and economic order bring prosperity, which at this point is kind of preposterous. But even if you take those things at face value, if you don't actually do them at some point, the entire house of cards becomes a little bit dicey and harder to legitimize.
I reckon we didn't sign so many treaties because we didn't want to tie our hands.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think constitutionally, treaties are, quote, the supreme law of the land. I think constitutionally, treaties have a very high place in constitutional law, but we'll use them as a rationale even if we don't sign them.
That's right.
But the eighth point of the Atlantic Charter is for all our peaceniks out there, so I want to quote it at some length, and it reads, quote, all of the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers. Oh boy, have we been doing that. They believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all other practical measures which will lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments. Now, I think it's completely sublime that, end quote. I think it's completely sublime. There's a recognition that war needs to stop for spiritual reasons as well as practical reasons.
Sure.
And I think it also reads like a manifesto to disarm America.
Yeah.
Because we're just been such a rampager since post-World War II.
I mean, there's been so many reputable polls. When you do a poll in every established country that's more than 100 years old on the planet, when you just ask their general populace, who do you think is the most dangerous country on the planet Earth? Like 83% of them say the United States. And it's immediate, and it's across the board. Like, it is 83% of established cultures on the planet Earth. When you ask them who's the most dangerous country on the planet Earth, they all say it's the United States. And we're only 6% of the population of the entire planet. So basically 83% of 94% of the population answers unanimously the most dangerous country on the planet Earth is the United States of America. I'm not sure normal American citizens would want to exude that to the rest of the planet. Like, I don't think that's what my fellow countrymen feel like would be the first thing that came out of their mouth. If one of my friends or family in this country that I love and I was born in invited me over for dinner, I would not like to stick a microphone in the face of the table and be like, hey, what's your global priority? I don't think 8 of those people out of 10 would say, I want to scare the shit out of every other person on the planet Earth. I don't think that's what would come out of their mouth.
I think I might have a link to that very poll in my previous article at stonefruit.substack.com. But
that
there
wouldn't
has
surprise me.
been
Yeah.
But there has been in particular a German collaboration between research firms and a think tank that comes out, I think, every year. And exactly as you say, they canvass the world, and the world unanimously agrees that the United States is the. And yet, in spite of that all, in January 1942, representatives of 26 of the Allies, including the Soviet Union, met to sign the Declaration by United Nations in pledging their support for the principles of the Atlantic Charter. So you see, the point of this article is that a lot of the language migrates. In April to June of 1945, the representatives of 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to forge the United Nations Charter. However, as I spoke of a cardinal sin, we spoke of a cardinal sin of the Palmer raids and the persecution of anti-war people and radicals during World War I. The cardinal sin of World War II that compromised all of America's good liberal intentions was Executive Order 9066, which Roosevelt signed on February 1942. This created the Japanese American internment camps. The first one was built in Manzanar. Brother Mark, I just got chills.
Yeah.
Because I've been to I still have chills.
Yeah, you know that country with your own eyes.
I've been there twice.
Yeah.
I hiked 1,000 miles of the Sierra Nevada. I saw it then. I've been road tripping through the West for much of the last year. I saw it again. Owen Valley, which is the Sierras and the White Ranges from California into Nevada, is a place of really haunting beauty.
Yeah.
And it's where LA gets all of its, and
Yeah, that's right.
where that's what the movie Chinatown. That's what the movie.
Yeah.
The city of Los Angeles just started, or they're exactly sure, started surreptitiously buying all the property along the river so that they could
Right.
acquire the riparian rights. And as soon as the farmers figured it out, they went to war.
Yeah.
They started sabotaging, dynamiting. It was real war against LA stealing their water. And
Yeah.
boy, I miss those days.
Yeah, it's like we feed you people. Like you're not allowed to. Yeah, you're not allowed to take the water from us that feeds you.
That kind of, I can't imagine that kind of resistance happening ever again, which is
Yeah.
why we are going to continue plummeting. But it's really it's a national historic site now, and it's haunting, and it's an area of haunting natural beauty. And between 1942 and 1945, 10 camps were built, and it detained 120,000 Japanese in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Arkansas.
Yeah.
You know, incidentally, they didn't inter the ones in Hawaii because they were in society. And they're about a third now. I don't know what they were then, but there was just too many and they were too important. So Hawaii did not inter ours, even though, you know, Pearl Harbor and all that. But it's the 1944 Korematsu versus U.S. Supreme Court case said it was all legal, quote, military necessity and not racially motivated. Not racially motivated.
Preposterous.
So Justice Hugo Black wrote the majority opinion, and it was, quote, all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect and require the most rigid scrutiny, end quote. But he didn't say it was unconstitutional. And, quote,
Right.
pressing public necessity may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions. Racial antagonism never can.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is such bullshit because they did it anyway.
Yep.
But Robert Jackson had an excellent dissent. And he said, quote, Korematsu has been convicted of an act not commonly thought a crime. It consists merely of being present in the state whereof he is a citizen, near the place where he is born, and where all his life he has lived. End quote. So Jackson didn't think wartime security, quote unquote, was an
This is so important what you're going through. I can still hear you. I have to step away. Keep reading. Yeah. This is really important for everybody.
Will do. Yeah, the Japanese American internment is one of the worst blights on America's entire history. So that's 120,000 other internees are denied their constitutional rights. And Jackson said the order was, quote, the legalization of racism and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And he made exactly the right point when he wondered, quote, when he wondered how different it was from, quote, the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which this nation is now pledged to destroy, end quote. So multilateral institutions are a key feature of any international liberal democratic order. So let's rattle off a few. In April 1944, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, was formed. In July 1944, IMF and World Bank were formed. In December 1948, the First General Assembly of the United Nations was held in Paris. So, as the Atlantic Charter set out the general terms of the Anglo-American partnership during World War II,
right.
So too did the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set out the general terms of the global partnership in the post-World War II international liberal democratic order. And brother Mark, I had not read this document before. And to quote a pop song from the 80s, because I am Gen X, she's a beauty.
Yeah, right.
It starts off with a bang. Article 1, quote, all human beings. See, now Eleanor Roosevelt kind of led the charge on helping be the executive to craft all of this. She took a leadership role in the creation of this.
And that was such a beautiful reference that you made, and such a cool point. And she was kind of late to coming, but if you just go out from the Eleanor Roosevelt tree, right? Like the whole feminist progressive Boston situation at that time was, I mean, you're talking about Emily and Charlotte Bronte, and like it really gets into a great deal of literature and progressive thinking that was exploding at the time among women-specific organizations, clubs, and groups. She became a voice of something that was already powerful and brilliant and beautiful of its own accord for at least 40 or 50 years. She brought into the public lexicon conversations that were being had for quite some time in that area of the country at the time.
Yes, I am remiss, but she had a partner in goodness, an Indian woman. I don't recall her name.
Yeah.
But Eleanor Roosevelt and this Indian woman changed the wording from all men are born free and equal in dignity and rights to all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And how important is that, Mark French?
Yeah, exactly.
Man to human beings.
Yeah, that's right.
But the quote for Article 1 is resounding. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So I want to spend some time with this document because it's so lovely. And Article 23 speaks to labor rights. Quote, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Article 25 is a resounding demand for robust Social Security. Quote, Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or any lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. What a beautiful aspiration.
Yeah.
And labor rights and Social Security used to be basic features of the core states of global capitalism.
Yeah.
In America, it's certainly exemplified by the New Deal and renewed by the Johnson administration as the Great Society.
Mm-hmm.
But the marker everyone would always point to is the election of Reagan and Thatcher, which plunged America and the UK into neoliberal plutocratic corporatism,
Yeah.
which has steadily eroded these basic rights.
I mean, that's the Fukuyama, there is no future. This is the only way.
Yeah.
I mean, Thatcher's the one that said there is no other way. This is the way.
I think she said there is no
other alternative.
I think she said there is no society.
Yeah, that's right.
You're only individuals.
Yeah,
but,
that's yeah.
But Reagan and Thatcher provided the model and the example for the rest of the core states to begin stripping all of these rights.
I mean, it's the reason that I still let these octogenarians that are deciding policy for millions and hundreds of millions, and in some case billions of people, they really believed that bullshit at the time. So they really did. That's the only way they could have slept at night. So that's why, you know, if that's what the consensus was, I can't put myself in that position, being only in the middle of my life, very quickly nearing 50. That's the way that I'm able to swallow the decisions that they made, is by saying that they really firmly believed in the Austrian school, Milton Friedman situations that were going on at the time.
There's some interesting, compelling things about the Austrian school, but I think the way Friedman and University of Chicago bastardized it is pretty horrifying. But Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, quote, "The right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion." But other articles speak to the necessary preconditions for that freedom of thought and conscience in very interesting ways. And Article 19 enunciates how crucial free access to information is, which is so relevant today now that big tech is turning into a disinformation governance regime. But Article 19 states, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." As you and I are doing, my brother Mark, to our dozens of faithful listeners.
For now,
we're building a listenership. But unique among any international accord is how they speak about the ultimate ends of all of these rights.
Yes.
That should be provided to the citizenry in the ideal world. All of the best goals of education. In previous episodes of the Hardline According to Stonefruit, we've talked about how education in America, elite education, Ivy League, Stanford, peer institutions, it's about credentialing. And they go into law, finance, consulting mostly, and make a lot of money and just undergird neoliberalism. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that the ultimate end is the free and full development of the human personality. And Article 22 says that, quote, economic, social, and cultural rights, end quote, are, quote, indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. They circle back to that phrase again in Article 26, which is, quote, education shall be directed towards the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And as an educator, it sets my heart aflutter to hear language like that.
Yeah.
Because it has become credentialing. And I'm a big proponent of small L liberal education, where you think well, read well, write well, speak well, and develop your personality. It's not all about getting the paper to then go out and make a lot of money and
Sure.
help be a technocrat for the forces of destruction and evil.
Yeah, that's more of a German style apprenticeship, but for satanic purposes.
Aptly phrased, Mark. But you know what's interesting too is Article 29. It says that this development has to occur within a social context.
Mm-hmm.
And it states that, quote, everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible, end quote. And our dear Eleanor Roosevelt was exactly correct when she called the Universal Declaration, quote, the international Magna Carta of all mankind everywhere.
Well, there it is, right?
God bless her.
God bless her.
And for me, a pivotal moment that compromised America's ability to lead a truly liberal international democratic order was the 1944 Democratic Convention battle for the vice presidency. Back then, the Veep stakes were competitive. The president didn't just announce the running mate like they do now.
Yeah.
And Roosevelt's third term Veep was his previous Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace. And you know how I figured out who Henry Wallace was, Mark?
I don't.
Listening to Cornel West.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
I listened to pretty much every Cornel West YouTube I could possibly find.
Well, the thing about Cornell, too, is one of his greatest mentors, one of his most important professors was Sheldon Wallen. And Sheldon Wallen probably laid this out, what we're going through right now. Sheldon Wallen laid this out in like the 70s or 60s.
I think Chris Hedges called Sheldon Wallen our greatest political philosopher.
Of our, yeah, absolutely. Since Thomas Paine, I would put Sheldon Wallen right underneath Thomas Paine as having his finger on the pulse of American discord, I guess, is the politest way that I'll put it. He's a Thomas Paine and Sheldon Wallen, to me, are two of the most relevant writers of the American climate of anyone that I've ever been exposed to. And I really, really love and respect Cornel West.
Thomas Paine is my favorite of the so-called founding fathers because he was the most rebellious of all of them.
Well, and I think it's the only divergence I have from you. I would call it the most honest.
Amen.
Rebellion is a term that is left to us by people that are being dishonest. So when you have a plutocracy or an oligarchy in power, that doesn't work for the language and documents and philosophy that founded this country. And I think it's one of the fun things about your piece that you're going through right now is it points out the hypocrisies of the very founding documents. They were always kind of a little bit of a lie at its inception. But at the same time, the other side of it is they tell so much truth and they're so powerful. I look at the project as an undone project that if you really care about its founding language, you should take the time to see it through because we don't know what it's supposed to look like yet.
I spoke to some people at a school in Somaliland, which is the British portion of Somalia, which has been effectively an independent country for decades with elections for decades, but is still unrecognized. And one of the guys I spoke to there told me that he knew that two doctoral performance studies students attended Cornell West's classes, which is understandable because he's a brilliant performer as a public intellectual.
Sure.
And part of his performance in his extraordinarily charismatic and gifted talks is to what I would say, like the Hare Krishnas, to chant the holy names. He just names people that were important in American history.
Chant the holy names. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a Hare Krishna temple in Honolulu, and I was the gardener for a year in exchange for prasadam, which is their blessed vegetarian food.
Oh, yeah.
And I never became a Hare Krishna, but I flirted around the edges. And
sure.
they had a food truck on the University of Hawaii campus. So when I was a doctoral student, because of my gardening, I was allowed to. I bought a nested steel tin, like a Chinese Asian lunchbox tin, with 4 stacks, and I'd go into the lunch truck and fill each of the 4 up and walk out with. That was enough for lunch and dinner.
Well, it was the experience was almost the same for me. In the U District in Seattle, there was a group of Hare Krishnas that had a gathering place in a dilapidated strip mall. And I had a board seat as the treasurer of an animal rights network at the time. So I considered it a conflict of interest to not be no honey, no leather, strictly vegan during those times of my life, and also being insatiably curious in how other people get along with each other. So we agreed with each other that the Hare Krishnas that I ate with and broke bread with and spent time with, just because we had aligned view at the time, those people fed me whenever I was hungry and provided me with literary, spiritual nourishment whenever I sought it and wanted to be a part of a group, just because I was open to giving their lifestyle and spirit and ideology to other people, because I thought it was worthwhile and wholesome and beautiful.
I consider myself first and foremost a Buddhist Taoist mystic.
Same.
But I am most definitely also a Hindu, and have read deeply in the Vedic literature.
Yeah, the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah, I agree.
Upanishads, yeah, all that. And
yeah,
even though the Hare Krishnas had their excesses in the 70s, which is, I advise you and any of our listeners that are interested in the wild 70s years in particular of the Hare Krishnas to read a book called Monkey on a Stick.
It's unforgettable. Yeah.
Yeah. Prabhupada said we need to put a monkey on a stick to scare people away. And Prabhupada is the founder of Hare Krishnas in America. And this book is a history of them. And yeah, in the 70s, they were gun running, drugs, screwing their devotees. There was no clear line of succession. There were about 8 people vying for it. It was crazy.
Crazy.
But theologically speaking, it's just fundamentalist Bhakti Krishna yoga.
That's right.
Theologically, it's not that bizarre.
Right.
And I'm more of a Shiva guy, but I was a gardener there, and it's in a beautiful valley, Nu'uanu, just behind downtown Honolulu, on a Henry Ford had a mansion there. So it's a Henry Ford mansion on a large parcel of land in a beautiful valley, and there's some wild cockatiels that have gotten loose and started spawning around there. And there's the garden there that I was tending. Part of it was a big patch of sacred Tulsi basil.
Yeah.
And so I'm tending the basil, and I see a devotee come out in a sari, and there's cockatiels floating by, and I'm thinking, what century am I in?
Yeah. It could have been any.
Yeah.
It could have been
What
any.
country? What country am I in? What century am I in?
It doesn't matter. And that's the fun thing about your work. You've opened my eyes to this has been going on for a long time. So we can all pretend that what we're going through and witnessing right now is unique, but it isn't. We've been having these discussions in a modern iteration for a really, really long time. And if you really want to boil back their roots, I mean, you're talking about realistically 2,500 years BC. I mean, this has been going on for a while. So
Yes, sir.
how arrogant, how arrogant or naive or silly do we have to be to pretend that the things that we're discussing on a daily basis haven't been being discussed for quite a long time?
Amen.
So the thing that I find really relevant and interesting about your work, and the reason that I pay attention to it wholeheartedly, is because just because it's the issue of the day, it's always been also the eternal cosmic issue of the day. We've been talking about it for a super long time. So I don't want to embarrass anyone because of it. I'm not trying to vilify anyone. I just want to have a real conversation. And I think your work is so relevant that it creates a portal to having a realistic, mature conversation about the issues of the cosmic day.
I couldn't agree more. And let's say organized human civilization dates back to about 5,000 BC.
Sure.
And
to not get laughed out of the room, why not? Yeah.
Maybe 10,000. Let's say 5,000.
Sure.
And in that period, from Mesopotamia and Egypt and China and Indus River and all the places where humanity first emerged out of the Neolithic period, they have been contending, the common people have been contending with a alliance of the theocrats and the mercantile class and the political class. And that has not changed, Mark French.
No, it hasn't. It is not.
That is exactly what we continue to strive to understand, and not allow the political class to use war and artificial scarcity to deny us our natural ecstasy. But because the bubble economy rape is over, because there's nothing else left to rape, I think the organized civilization that dates back to 5000 BC probably won't outlast this century.
I agree with that.
It's not going to get Mad Max overnight, but I think in a slow series of cascading geopolitical, ecological, and economic shocks, it's gradually going to get
I agree with that. Yeah, 80 years from now, yeah, I agree with that completely. 80 years from right now, this second, is either going to be really cool or really weird. And we have to all decide that right now.
So as the Hare Krishnas chant the holy names, so too does Cornel West chant the holy names.
Yeah,
and you know,
he does. He does.
As a researcher, as an academic, as just a curious human being, period. I mean, that's why I have this bushel of degrees that are so useless to me. It's because I'm curious, and I've done more reading outside of the degrees. But when he mentions people, I look them up.
Yeah.
So when he talks about Fannie Lou Hamer, who's a black woman farmer from the South who played an instrumental role in the civil rights movement, who is not an intellectual from the prophetic religious traditions like Malcolm X or MLK. She was a farmer, I believe. So I looked her up, and she seemed awesome. And he mentioned Abraham Heschel. I think he's the rabbi, Abraham Heschel.
Rabbi in New York.
And I looked him up, and who's this guy? And he's awesome. And he's literally shoulder to shoulder with MLK in a lot of the most
telling the truth.
I mean, in a lot of the most important marches, there's pictures of him literally shoulder to shoulder with Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And another guy that Cornel West mentioned was Henry Wallace. So I look him up, and who's this guy? It turns out he's an iconic progressive, a staunch proponent of labor rights, desegregation, and government dedicated to social welfare. And Cornel West, thank you for the tip. And I looked this guy up. I listened to some of his speeches, and there's a link at stonefruit.substack.com. And he says that the war is being fought for, quote, a people's peace, and, quote, a century of the common man.
Yeah.
And the 1944 convention selected the vice president by floor votes. And Wallace's egalitarianism made the party bosses extremely uneasy. Sound familiar, Mark?
Yeah.
Just like
Sanders.
After Sanders blew everyone in Nevada, Obama whipped out his phone, started making some calls. So, you know, what happened then happens now. And the bosses laid down the law to Roosevelt that Wallace was acceptable. And Truman was the compromise choice.
Yeah.
And Wallace was not invited to the convention, but he came anyway. And he wanted to rally his supporters to get the vote and overcome the edicts of the party bosses. And he had a plurality of votes on the first round, but he lost the second round to Truman. And when he ran for 1948 with the Progressive Party, he only garnered 3% of the vote. What happens then happens now. Another third party run went nowhere, even being led by a progressive champion, 3% of the vote. So it's a counterfactual to imagine how life would have been in America if Wallace had stayed on. But I think that the national security state might have never been created, and the Cold War might have never happened. Although some people think this is inaccurate. But let's plausible interpretation. Then America's leadership of an international liberal democratic order might have actually been liberal.
Yes.
And less fraught with profound hypocrisy.
That's
not
really what it
subject
comes
to
down to. Yeah.
Yeah, less fraught with hypocrisy, not subject to a horrifying and incessant litany of war, political assassination, suppression of movements for social change, election manipulation, and covert operations, as has been the reality since World War II. And we've mentioned it on previous episodes. William Blum's classic, Killing Hope. It describes 55 such episodes.
Interventions. Yeah.
All that type of stuff after World War II. And that doesn't even close the 20th century.
It does not.
That is a book I would advise any of our listeners to read to understand the mayhem, the trail of mayhem, destruction, and cruelty and tears that America has laid waste throughout the world since World War II.
Yes.
So if Wallace had prevailed, maybe neoliberalism may not have developed as such an incredibly potent social force.
I know, but that was
we might not.
That was one of the funnest, coolest lines that I read in the piece on Substack that you released. It would have. So, Mikhail Koletsky in 1943 laid out the 70s stagflation in 1943 in a very short piece on what the American post-World War II pursuit of full employment was going to look like. And he wasn't wrong. So neoliberalism would have happened anyway. That's what full employment at the behest of a rentier class, that's just what it looks like. So if you go from outright conquest and slavery into feudalism, into capitalism, it all looks exactly the same, which is what I think is so amazing about what you have aggregated and put together for everyone. It looks the same. You can blow smoke up everyone's ass and create fluffy language anywhere, but that is what this level of inequality ends up looking like.
You know, for me, my hopes died with the 60s, with COINTELPROGRAM and the overt deep state murder, harassment, incarceration of so many brilliant liberal and revolutionary leaders.
That's right.
It casts a very long shadow over any faith of America living up to its promise. And we hit that magic. And we hit that magic year, 1971. Every indicator of fairness and progress, working middle class collapsed, never to recover.
Never to recover.
Reagan and the Republican side and the Democratic Leadership Council and the Democratic side whose prominent leaders, I knew it included Gore and Clinton. I didn't know it included Joe Biden.
Absolutely.
But those two forces put America in the death grip of neoliberalism now.
Yep.
Never to recover.
Never to recover.
And I want to jump back to our boy Mearsheimer, but I want to add Eikenberry and Rand to give us some mainstream definitions of key aspects of the international liberal democratic order. Mearsheimer and Eikenberry are world-renowned scholars of that order. And the Rand Corporation is a Santa Monica think tank that is the mad laboratory of American hegemony. But all of their descriptions, mainstream as they are, universally accepted as they are deeply fraught with the profound hypocrisy the authors cannot even see, which is a polite way of saying they are full of shit.
Yeah.
As we discussed in the last episode, Mearsheimer's 2019 Bound to Fail. It provided a platitudinous yet commonplace description of liberal ideology. Quote, at its core, liberalism is an individualistic ideology that places great weight on the concept of inalienable rights. This belief, which says that every individual on earth has the same set of basic rights, is what underpins the universalistic dimension of liberalism. Turns out they're quite alienable, Mark French. Quite alienable indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
I dare say they are on the trash heap, and Congress, instead of serving the people, does everything they possibly can do to keep them alienated. And one of Eikenberry's classic works is his 2012 Liberal Leviathan, which platitudinous yet commonplace description of the key features of that order. Quote, open markets, international institutions, cooperative, democratic community, progressive change, collective probability, the rule of law, end quote. Let's break that down, Brother Mark. Markets are rigged.
Yes.
Institutions are used to provide a forum for the U.S. to exert control.
Yes.
Cooperative security or NATO continue to exist long after their purpose expired. And I didn't believe you about Colombia, but I have an open mind and I'm always ready to be corrected. And you informed me that Colombia is a junior partner in NATO. Guess what? I got a favor.
More cowbell.
You know what? You know what will solve world peace? More cowbell.
What? More cowbell. Yeah.
No, NATO's branching out to Asia. South Korea just joined their cyber defense unit. Mind blown.
Yeah.
So, and no democratic community exists.
No, the Colombia thing is real. The South Korea thing is real. The language to actually join is very specific because of its founding. But the idea that monetarily, fiscally, there are countries that have been participating in the NATO project well after its inception that don't make any sense from what they set out in the first place. And you point that stuff out all the time. Colombia taking a different direction is actually going to be a point of stress for some people and curiosity for others. I'm extremely curious how the Colombia situation plays out. Because
following this,
what's that?
Proceed.
No, I'm just because, okay, so the Colombia thing specifically, now that I found out they have been a NATO junior partner for a really long time, almost, I think it was like a mid 80s, late 90s thing that Colombia was ground zero for the drug war and the Monroe Doctrine in its modern form in South America. So I'm very curious now that the head of their state, but all the oligarch families, just because the president is the president, Colombia still has in their own structure our version of the House and the Senate, if you will, right? And it still has the judiciary for Americans to understand. So just because the public has said, hey, we're going to go in a populist, leftist, people-oriented position, you can't automatically dispossess the families that have already bought voting seats in the House and Congress, I guess, is the easiest way to say to Americans. Just because the president is the president, like AMLO in Mexico right now, Lopez Obrador in Mexico, one of our NAFTA partners, codified by Trump, no less, in a very meaningful way within the last few years. So just because Mexico has a populist leftist president, that hasn't meant much meaningfully on the global policy scale. So I don't want to overblow Colombia's recent election. Clearly, the working class and normal people in Colombia and Mexico are completely pissed off and sick of corruption, which I think is the current American iteration. We don't know what that's going to look like. So I don't want to overblow the fact that this Colombian guy got elected. At the end of the day, you still have to get things done through those congressional legal obligations. I don't know if he's going to be able to do anything there. It wouldn't be any different than if Bernie Sanders was elected president in 2016, because the United States hated Clinton and Trump so bad. Like, they didn't want more of the same, right? Like, the Americans were just so pissed off. They didn't want anybody from the Clinton Obama line. They didn't want anybody from the Reagan Bush line. So Trump performed very high, and Sanders would have been the nominee if it wasn't for the fuckery of Obama and Clinton. So I'm not saying that any of the Central or South American presidents are going to get anything done, because they still have to get through the structure that we also have in place, right? Which makes all American progressive look like idiots. And the Tea Party right in the United States also don't really care. That's only an amalgamation of the Southern Jesus gun South and the fake libertarian money on the right, the Mormons and everybody. So I think the only thing that's become more clear about Central and South America is they already know what the end is going to be, capitulating to the fake finance capital of the United States. No one's into it anymore. People are going to start to shuck the American dollar by the droves. I think that's the only thing that it makes clear. The things that are going on in Argentina and Brazil and Colombia make it very, very clear people are going to start to move away from the oil and Wall Street American dollar. Everybody's scared of it because they know that it's tenuous.
I believe there was a candidate in Colombia that wanted to nationalize the oil. He didn't
That's right.
win. He didn't win. So, fingers crossed with these guys. We'll see. But my point with Mearsheimer, Eikenberry, and now Rand is that these are the mainstream ideas about the international liberal democratic order. But
Yes.
they're all wrong and not empirical. And the Rand Corporation says, quote, the values are representative government, human rights, and other liberal concepts such as non-aggression, self-determination, and the peaceful settlement of disputes, end quote.
Yes.
Representative government means elections, but if they're controlled by the donor class and don't have any egalitarian options, how representative are they? Human rights, significant achievement of the post-war period? Wishful thinking. It's often used as a concept and a pretext to scold and harass nation states that are not cooperative with American capital.
That's right.
Non-aggression? Well, that sure as shit doesn't apply to the American empire, certainly not the American empire in its dotage.
That's right.
Self-determination? That's a perpetual challenge, especially for indigenous people.
Yeah.
So those three guys I took as mainstream examples, but they're just aspirational and diluted. They are not empirical.
Yeah.
So the immense promise within the international liberal democratic order, which is spelled out perfectly by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has never come close to being fully implemented. And now that neoliberalism and plutocracy have taken hold, these rights, furthermore, they are skeletal remains.
And so being attacked on the daily, publicly.
And so elections may be enough to enable the mainstream to satisfy itself that an international liberal democratic order exists. It was fraught with contradictions from the start, and it's hanging by a thread now.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the piece.
Amazing. I mean, it's such good work. Stonefruit, Substack.com, go. I mean, it's such a beautiful piece, because even if you're, to bastardize the term, like, even if this were for laymen, right? Like these are the real conversations of the day that need to be happening, and you aren't going to find it anywhere. Like, it really is your own circle, your own friends, the professionals that you respect. Like, we are in a new McCarthy period, to where if you say things outside of the orthodoxy, not only are you not going to be hired, but you could be fired. Like, you could be vilified in a professional space forever if you're not willing to just bow down and kiss the ring and say things that they want to be said. So your work is just so important. I think it's a shining light of things that need to be discussed. I think it's done in a meaningful way. You have no adherence to ruling ideology. It's just an honest, raw, straightforward conversation around things that matter, that policy-wise are going to affect lives going forward for a very long period of time. So I think if anyone feigns interest in this area, the work that you're doing, I think, is so vital and important to pay attention to. Like, are you sunk into these things? Do you care? If you do care and you want to be sunk in, please pay attention to Stonefruit's work.
Brother Mark, I think we're doing it together as a team because we're intelligent, we're curious, and as jaded and as wild lives as we have both led, we still have enough spunk to give a shit. So let us continue to make content on as regular a basis as possible and continue to develop a listenership, because we're not just doing this for intellectual masturbation. I think we both want this to have a concrete social impact, and it's not going to happen overnight. But Brother Mark, may we march up this mountain together. This has been another edition of the Hardline According to Stonefruit with my main man, my partner in goodness, Mark French. Thank you, Internet.
Be well, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Internet people. And we are signing off.